welcome back to the Petey Performance Podcast, Season 3 after a hiatus. A much welcome break it was had. I was actually in Bali. For anybody that's following me on social media, they would have seen. Christmas was great as well. Fantastic to get a break, like my athletes as well. So I'm coming back refreshed, rejuvenated, and ready to attack this season in a pre-season. Loads of energy. And as a coach, I'm going to be trying to bring loads of energy to the teams and the environments that I'm working in, because that is our currency as coaches. That's what you're dealing in. You're trying to add energy to the group, positive energy, and bring a bit of positivity to the group so that we can attack the preseason. We come motivated, we come engaged and ready to improve and adapt and work hard and work diligently and do the right things and do them in the right way. So I'm back with most of my teams. We're back a couple of weeks with the senior men's team out of Thomas Davis. We are going back with the hurlers and the ladies tonight. We have the minors coming in. We have developmental groups coming in over the next couple of weeks. And then I've been down to Mayo working with a club down in Mayo too. And just all really positive. We've had our audits of last season. We've had our meetings, we've talked about our values, talked about our mission statement, talked about our behaviors we'd like to elicit and like to implement into this season. And I love that side of the training and that side of the program. And I love talking to people about why you play. And it all generally comes back to the same reasons. We're playing Gaelic games for enjoyment, but there's a lot of pride in playing them and representing your team, representing yourself, representing your family, representing your community as positively and in the best way possible. So it's really exciting. I love getting deep on things like that and really challenging the athletes and them challenging us as coaches as well, because it's a two-way street. So we come to it. We have to put our best foot forward so that the athletes can put their best foot forward. But it needs to be reciprocated both ways. I've seen it happen where it's not reciprocated from the athlete's standpoint. And unfortunately, it's like pulling a resistant mule to the water or trying to bring a horse to water, as they say, but you can't make it drink. And then I've seen it the other way, where coaches aren't bought in and athletes get frustrated then because they're fully bought into trying to improve, but they feel like it's not being reciprocated. And as a result, it leads to a little bit of contentious environment and not a whole pile of trust. And we all know that if you're going to be effective as a coach, you need to have trust, you need to have buy-in, and you need to create that positive environment as best as you can. And you can't leave anything unsaid. It needs to be an open and honest and brutally honest environment. And I've seen that from my teams, and hopefully it carries on. You're going to have to check in multiple times over the course of the season to make sure that things are still going the way that it was planned. But it's exciting. It's exciting, and it's great as a strength and conditioning coach at this time of the season, because you have a little bit more of a license to push the athletes from a developmental perspective. You're probably taking up more of an importance in what you are doing in preparing them to train, preparing them to play the game, and writing a program. And they all come really motivated and ready to change and ready to improve. It's just about how long you can keep them engaged and how you can stress them and how you can help them to realize their potential, I suppose. So all very, very positive. But as I did last year in season 2, I gave ye an in-season S&C podcast. I gave ye an off-season S&C podcast. And this was requested last year, but I thought it would be ample time and the right time to do it now, and have a pre-season strength and conditioning podcast about how I would do things. It might not be right. It might be wrong. It might not work in certain environments. It might work in others, but it's a broad and general perspective that I'm going to hopefully deliver so that so I can provide you guys with value, but also you guys can challenge your own process and maybe challenge mine. So if you're feeling like you're stuck and you don't know where to start, then feel free to get in touch. I always love having conversations with coaches and athletes, but I'm going to go through it today, and it's going to be an open book because, as I've said before, the information is all out there. The information is on the internet for you guys. I'm delivering it to you guys, But if we hold our cards really close to our chest and don't show what we're doing, we're not really making and helping the industry move forward at all. Because, and as well as that, it comes from a scarcity mindset, a place where you believe everybody's out to get you, and and you believe you have the secret sauce, you have the special ingredient. So it comes from a place of ego as well, in that you believe that if people did what you were doing, then they would be able to challenge you and they would ultimately beat you. So it doesn't really come from a place of confidence. I'm confident in my own system that I could deliver and show people how it's done, but it won't be they won't be able to implement it in the same way that I'm able to implement it. As well as that, what works in one environment may not work in another environment. So you really have to refine your process and make it suit the athletes that are in front of you. And it's not really like the what of what we do is important, but it's how you do it that is the most important. It's bringing that intensity and that intent to every training session, pushing yourself, pushing your athletes, and driving that adaptation, and really being focused and coming with an open mindset and a growth mindset and a perspective that I'm here to improve and I'm going to leave no stone unturned in searching for that improvement. But it's also refining and putting the work in when it needs to be put in, and then away from the field and away from the training, recovering as best as you can as well. So that comes down to your sleep. That comes down to how you structure your training and how you switch off away from the training session. So you all know at this stage, I prefer to go with the principle of cumulative load, and I like to have my pitch sessions and my gym sessions on the same day. I think it allows amateur athletes to have more of a life outside of the sport, which allows them to switch off, and it doesn't become a drag to turn up to training because they're only coming up to the field 3 times a week, 2 times a week, 4 times a week max, unless they're playing a dual sport, in which case I manage as best I can. But I do suggest that that is almost impossible to do without running into some niggles throughout the season. Some freaks of nature will be able to do so, but it is an extremely difficult thing to do. You're playing as many games as an NBA athlete would play almost, and you're working a full-time job alongside that. You don't have the same resources in terms of recovery, nutrition, hydration, sleep, etc., and you're not getting paid for it as well. So you're doing it for the love of the game. I have great admiration and great respect for the people that do it and have pride in their parish and want to represent their parish at every opportunity. And for some of them, it is their opportunity to switch off. But as I say all the time, if you want to get really good at a sport, you probably need to train more specifically for that sport. Now, the games of hurling and Gaelic football are inherently similar in terms of their demands, physical demands, but sometimes less is more in terms of how we reach that peak performance for a specific sport. So getting up to the pitch and training 6 times a week does not mean that it's going to be better than getting to the pitch and doing 3 solid sessions, which is where my perspective and my philosophy comes from. We're better off driving intent and having the energy, both physiologically and psychologically, to push and strive for adaptation in those 2 to 3 sessions a week than we are than spreading them out across the week, where I have seen athletes and coaches experience burnout more commonly when they are up the field too often, because they're feeling like they're missing out on too much. You will miss out on some things as an athlete, but that's the choice you make, I suppose. And it doesn't mean you have to miss out on everything as well, just because you're playing GAA. And that has been the attitude for a long, long time. But as my ladies say, give us our Friday nights back. And I'm happy to give them their Friday nights back at the right times of the year. I'm happy to schedule in the right times to take breaks so that they can go away on their holidays and enjoy themselves as best as they can. But still focused on making them the best possible athletes that they can be, or putting them in a position where they can take the lead and become the best possible athletes and best possible footballers, camogie players, hurlers that they possibly can be. Because we are just guides as coaches. We can guide them to the oasis in the desert, but they have to take that first step and they have to drink the water, I suppose. So lots of analogies there. I hope I'm not going a little bit too much on them, but first question that comes to mind when we take up pre-season S&C, and commonly asked question as well is, how much time do we need for the pre-season? And it really does depend. And it depends on the county that you're in. It depends on the league schedule. It depends on the match schedule for the whole year. And it depends on your facilities, your resources, as well as when you finished last year. So how you got on, like the junior championship finals and the intermediate were just on last week, senior on this week. So obviously it'd be hard to get straight into a preseason after that. Some of those athletes will have to go into somewhat of an off-season period, and they'll probably have to cycle and trial some new players in the early stages of the league campaign as they give their more experienced players some time off. So much deserved and needed time off as well. I'm sure David Clifford and Paudie Clifford need a little bit of time off after the long season that they've had. No doubt, and undoubtedly the split season does work a little bit better. It's great to have those finals out of the way in January. It didn't always happen previously, and it is hopefully more optimal from a physical and from a lifestyle perspective than it was previously when we were running into March to have those finals and the league was already well underway. Madness, really. And you try and explain this to somebody not from Ireland and they think we are mad, and maybe we are mad, but we love the madness. That's why we play, that's why we participate, so we're happy to do so. So in terms of the length of the preseason, and I've been asked by a number of the coaches how long we need. It's hard when you don't have the fixture schedule, but you can estimate it based off last year, because last year did kind of work. The league and championship has been pushed by 1 week, I believe. So you can just push it on by 1 week this year. But you need as little or as much as necessary. So if you have 10 weeks till your first fixture, 10 weeks is awesome. You have loads of time to prepare. But I would probably schedule in some games in that 10 weeks. And I think pushing and driving adaptation and being progressive for 10 weeks is a little bit long. So I probably would cycle in a deload if the preseason is going to be that long. If you have only 4 to 5 weeks, that is fine. You just get a little bit more aggressive with the preseason approach rather than the conservative approach that you would use for 8 to 10 weeks. But you probably are going to make the allowance that the first couple of league games, if they are scheduled in February, you're not going to be peaking yet for those, because it's very hard to be peaking after 3 to 4 weeks of training. So your preseason is probably encroaching and running into those first couple of weeks, and it did for us last year, and that was totally fine. We said, and the girls actually said to me after the first 3 weeks, or the first 3 games, were absolutely knackered. And I said, I know, but just wait for the next couple of weeks when we back off a little bit and you're going to be feeling good, because the league wasn't a focus point for us. So it didn't really matter. And it does matter in a sense. You want to put your best foot forward and you want to win your games, and every game is important and you do your 100% best in that game. But it's fine if the championship down the line is your primary focus, as it is for everybody, to trial new players in those early stages of the league and use them as somewhat of a trialing period for the championship, giving people opportunities to state their claim for a place in the squad, giving people the opportunities to integrate into the squad if they're new to the squad, a younger player, giving people the opportunities to learn the tactical system as well, because that's going to take some time as well. It's not going to be fully refined at the start of the year. You're going to have nuances to it. You're going to have changes from last year. So that's still a learning period. And maybe in the final few weeks, when you're really stressing that tactical aspect of the game, you do back off in terms of your approach to your S&C, in terms of the length of time you're given to the S&C, but you do not back off in terms of intensity. The intensity and the intent remains the same and remains of a high standard. You're just doing less quantity, but very high quality work. And that should be the case the whole way through the season. As you know, the quality is the most important aspect. So 15, 20 minutes of dedicated, hard, really high quality work is going to be better than 60 minutes of absolute rubbish. So that's my philosophy on it. And that's probably kind of taken from the NBA in a way, that they will do post-game training sessions for their S&C or pre-game, because they don't really have the opportunity in between games because they have a game every 2 to 3 days. So I've used that principle from Daniel Bove, I suppose, and brought it over to the GAA, and it has worked well. We've reduced the injuries significantly last year, down 66%, as I've said previously. And we were happy with that, I suppose. If we can continue to refine it and improve our approach this year and focus on the areas where we had the most injuries, which are the common injuries for GAA, I suppose, then hopefully we'll be able to reduce it even further if the athletes bring themselves to the table, bring themselves to the party, and we can create the most positive environment in which to improve. So anywhere from 5 to 8, 9, 10 weeks, I'd say, is perfect. 10 weeks being probably a little bit long. I think 8 weeks is fine. But no matter how much time you have, you'll use it, and you'll use it as effectively as you possibly can. So in that preseason period, what are you doing? You're focused on building the frequency of training. And a useful analogy for the whole preseason period that I like to use comes from the IRFU and their approach to training youth athletes. So they have a good system in which initially they train to train, they say, following training to train, where you're building the capacity to train more, which a lot of training is for. Then you move to train to play. Then after you're training to play the game more effectively and be more specific in your training, then you're training to compete. And then finally, following that, you'll be training to win after that. I think there's 5 stages. I'm probably missing one, but it's a useful analogy, and it's crossover, I suppose, with the system for Bob Bondarchuk's system, which would be you'd have a GPP phase, a specific, so GPP being general physical preparation. That will last for a few weeks. Like, you can put in a GPP phase for 3 to 4 weeks and the athletes will see improvements from it, especially if they haven't been doing a lot over the off-season period, and especially if they're relatively weak and relatively unfit. So there's a lot to be said for a quality GPP phase. Following that, you're moving into a specific physical preparation period, or an SPP phase, where you get a little bit more specific with what you're doing in relation to the game. Before that, obviously, you are reverse engineering the game demands and the movements that are necessary for the sport, but you're training more general qualities, obviously, in the general physical preparation phase. So you're training a little bit of hypertrophy, you're training some strength, you're training a tiny bit of power, you're training capacity, you're training tissue tolerance and load tolerance and the ability to train, and your aerobic capacity as well. So very, very general qualities, but of high importance, because you've got to build that base level foundation before you can go and build the pyramid on top of it. So some athletes, if they're new to the group or if they're untrained, they could stay in that phase for 5-6 weeks and they would still see benefit in doing so. But if you have athletes that are probably a little bit more developed, then potentially it might be more advantageous to move them into the SPP phase earlier. If they've been really diligent over the off season and they've done all their general physical preparation already. So you're trying to cater in the group for different athletes and athletes that need different things, and they will all need different things. And this kind of comes back to pooling your athletes so that they're getting an individualized approach to training, but you don't have to write 30 different programs as your coach, because that's not really optimal for your energy, especially if you have multiple teams. So you're building the frequency actually as well before I move on. Frequency to training, so the ability to tolerate training 2, 3, 4 times a week. So initially you might start with just 2 sessions in the week, then you'll progress that to 3 down the line, then you might progress it to 4. We don't typically do so, but if you're planning to do 4 sessions in the season, then you probably should be doing 4 sessions. As well as that, if athletes feel like they like to do additional stuff, then they should be doing additional stuff to keep them stimulated and to keep them sane and keep them in the optimal mental state as well as the physical state. Some of them might need some extra strength work. Some of them might need some more hypertrophy work. Some of them might need extra speed, change of direction work. Some of them might need some off-feet conditioning. All of that is fine, and you can prescribe that to the athlete as needed. And that will work with the athlete pools as well. You can do so with the pooling of the athletes. And typically, I put the athletes into 3 different buckets based on what they need. So I'll have a strength and size focus bucket where I'll be more aggressive with the strength emphasis and with the volume of lifts that are in the program and hypertrophy work. That is the focus point of their programming for longer amount of the program. With all of these programs, I use a vertical integration approach, which we've gone through before, which basically means that we're focused on training all of the different various qualities, your aerobic, anaerobic conditioning, your strength, your hypertrophy, your power, etc. All of them. At different phases of the season, though, we will stress and focus on different physical qualities, if that makes sense. So for a specific microcycle of maybe 2 weeks or 1 week, we might have a particular emphasis on hypertrophy, or we might have a particular emphasis on strength or a particular emphasis on power. It may last longer than 2 weeks. Obviously, it could be 3-4 weeks. And then we might be entirely and almost solely focused in our programming on speed, but still doing a little bit of everything else. But there's going to be more of a speed emphasis in the training program, or potentially more of a power emphasis in the program. And that's obviously going to be inherently stressful and challenging from both a neural perspective and a physical perspective as well. So we won't be able to stay in that phase for a very long duration. So maybe we'll cycle back then towards more of a regeneration, conditioning, and hypertrophy focus in our vertical integration system, if that makes sense. It could be rubbish. It could be raw mate. You might be able to understand that I might not be delivering it as best as I possibly can. But if you have questions, as I said, just ask me and I'll be happy to go through them. So we'll have that strength and size bucket. Then we'll have a speed and power bucket in which I'll put the athletes that already have a high level of strength and probably a necessary level of strength for a sport that is usually non-contact if you're pretty good as a forward. If you're a back, there's a little bit more contact if you are good, obviously, but it's very quick, very high velocity. So speed and power and an ability to tolerate running loads is probably of primary importance in my philosophy towards S&C for GAA, because we do a lot of running, we do a lot of speed, sprinting, repeated sprint efforts, repeated change of direction efforts, and then you have a small element of contact, which we do work on for sure, but it's a smaller importance than potentially the running, the speed, the change of direction, in my perspective, and probably from my bias. If you move to a different team that doesn't have such a focus and emphasis on transition and fast transition and work rate and hand passing to get the ball up the field, etc., they have more of an emphasis on getting people behind the ball and being able to get around the attacker and be really strong in that contact scenario, then maybe they will have more of an emphasis on strength in their programming, especially if the athletes haven't worked a lot on strength already. So they'll get a lot of benefit from doing so. But as I've said previously, I can only bring what I deem necessary with my specific groups to the table. And if I was with a different group and had a different head coach that wanted to play the game a different way, then potentially I would change my approach to the S&C. Actually, not potentially, I definitely would change my approach to the S&C, because the number one question before you start the preseason, before you write the program, should be to the head coach: how do we want to play? Because otherwise you're just doing a totally general program for the whole year, which there is merit in, but it's not the best thing for the athletes. The way one team plays the game is not the way another team should play the game. So that means that their S&C and their strength and conditioning should be specific to the way that they play the game. It shouldn't be the same across the board. Sure, it's the same sport, but we play it differently. So the demands of the sport and the demands to play the game optimally in the way that you're going to play is going to be different. For an example, one team may keep their keeper in the net, keep their keeper in the goal. They mightn't clean up anything. They might just be there as a goalkeeper, take the kickouts, that's it. Or another team could bring their keeper out the field. Am I going to train the goalkeepers for those two teams the same? I absolutely am not, because the demands of the game are totally different for them. That is just an example. Last pool after speed and power, where we're focused more of an emphasis on the velocity of movement, more of an emphasis on developing that power. And I might stress them more from an intensity perspective in terms of the velocity of the movement, in terms of their plyometrics, in terms of their loaded lifts, be that trap bar jumps, be that Olympic lifts, etc. More of an emphasis on the speed. I might be more aggressive with my approach to their speed development in terms of the distance that I sprint them over, in terms of the number of efforts, in terms of their sprint volume, in terms of the number of change of directions, decelerations in a training session, and in terms of their extras as well. And then the last pool would be the conditioning and robustness group. In my perspective, that is generally the group that have gotten a little bit unfit over the off season, haven't really touched the whole pile. A lot of the time it tends to be the older athletes. The focus of that group is trying to prep the tissues so that they're able to tolerate the amount of training and tolerate match play without developing niggles, chronic injuries. So we'll go a little bit more high rep on that, and they'll get a lot from doing that because we're building the capacity of their muscles to tolerate that load. We're also developing the aerobic system. Obviously, if we go more high rep, there'll be more of an effect and more of an emphasis on, fancy word coming, capillarization. So developing, which will deliver more oxygen to the working muscles. So hopefully they'll be fitter. And then with our isometrics, we might go more of an emphasis on longer duration yielding isometrics with them rather than on the overcoming isometrics, the really high intensity where we're really focused on developing that power. As well as that, I might prescribe more conditioning for that group, so more high speed running. Generally in the off-season or in the pre-season rather, I would generally start them with one pitch session per week if I could, and then progress them to two after that. And then finally, when we're going back onto the pitch for the team sessions, then obviously you're progressing them to three because they need to be able to tolerate that down the line. Steadily progressing the amount that they're doing in terms of the duration of what it takes, as well as the distance that they're covering in the session, the amount of efforts, etc. And we can use GPS to analyze that, or we can simply just program in relation to the amount of efforts in both their speed, change of direction work, the amount of drills, the amount of emphasis we place on that, as well as the amount of efforts in their tempo running or mass running, depending on your preference. I generally go with tempo, or you can just extend the duration of their low intensity steady state running if that's what you're doing. But I tend to not do that because they're all generally pretty fit. And I don't believe we gain a lot from doing that. I think we need to be a little bit more specific in our approach to preparation for Gaelic games, as I've went through previously. How do I pool them into those groups then? The answer is we do a little bit of testing or monitoring in order to pool them into the groups. So we test probably their ability to generate force vertically a lot of the time. So we'll test their counter movement jump and their squat jump. We might do that unilateral, or we'll do a bilateral anyway. So 2 feet, just to break it down for the sport coaches that haven't a clue what I'm talking about. And then we'll do unilateral as well to assess imbalances. But specifically for pooling the athletes, we will test counter movement jump, squat jump, and RSI from a drop jump as well. And then from that, we can infer whether the athletes are better able to generate force concentrically or through a reactive jump, or so like your RSI, you're using the stretch shortening cycle, so you're exploding out of it, and if they get a high amount of jump height in a short amount of time, that indicates that they're quite a reactive athlete. And then you can test that and use your elastic index by comparing the counter movement jump and the squat jump. Or you can just look at their RSI versus their counter movement jump as well in terms of a ranking of tables. And you can infer whether they need a little bit more strength focus because they're quite explosive and reactive, but they might not be very strong, so a slower movement pattern. Or whether they need more ballistic because they're really, really strong, but they're not very reactive at all. And what I've seen a lot is my most explosive athletes, from an RSI, from a CMJ perspective, typically those are the athletes that run into trouble in terms of hamstring injuries. They're typically our fastest athlete. And posterior chain injuries in general, or lower limb injuries, that's what they run into, because potentially they are so fast, but they're not very strong. So we need to try to improve their robustness to tolerating those demands by adding in a little bit more strength work, a little bit more ISO, but also we will focus on other things too, like their control of their lower body, control of their pelvis, how they strike the ground, how they accelerate, how they change direction, etc. But we need to do a little bit of a focus in the gym as well on what they're doing in the gym. So, but the other answer for this as well is you can eyeball your athletes as well. If you know them really well and you have a keen coach's eye, you'll generally be pretty right in terms of who needs what. So you'll know your athletes that are really, really strong, but not very reactive. And you'll know your athletes that are very reactive, but not very strong. And then you'll know your athletes that aren't very fit at all. And then that strength and size group, who will pool into that, is typically the younger athletes that need to put on a little bit of strength and size and can tolerate a high volume of training. I'm probably not going to throw my older athletes into that strength and size group because they won't be able to tolerate and recover in time for the next session, if that makes sense. So if I was to go and this isn't the way that it's done, but if I was to pool them based on age, generally the strength and size group are a little bit younger and they need to put on a little bit of strength and size. The speed and power group are strong, and they are generally pretty fast. So we're making their strength even stronger. But they're generally the middle kind of group. So you can be a little bit more aggressive with them in terms of the velocity of movement and working on things that they haven't worked on yet, because most GAA athletes have just done a 5x5 program year round for the last 5 years. And then the conditioning and robustness group, as the older lads call them, they call themselves the hoppers because I get them doing a lot of rudiment hops, and a lot of plyometrics, extensive plyometrics, because I don't want them to run into calf and Achilles injury issues. Shouldn't say injuries, during the course of the season, which does inevitably happen, but we try and manage it as best as we can. And that's generally the older category of athletes, but not necessarily. There will be some surprises if you're doing an effective testing protocol in the gym. And the benefits of doing the jump testing as well is that we can test it year round, and we test it once a week minimum. So we can tell based off that the readiness of the athlete to train, who is a little bit more fatigued than other athletes, who we need to back off of, who we need to maybe reduce the volume of work that they're doing, because I always prescribe a range of sets and a range of reps for the athletes to pick that they can deal with. And then it's a good opportunity to just talk to the athletes when they come over for the testing too, for the jumps, and see how they're getting on. And yeah, so in terms of the testing protocol, I try to stay away from 3 rep maxes, etc., 5 rep maxes, 1 rep maxes, because I don't find it to be very replicable throughout the season because of the amount and quantity of fixtures. And I feel that the fatigue plays into the effectiveness of that testing protocol in terms of the cumulative fatigue of the season, means that definitely and undoubtedly affects the athletes more so than it would if we just monitored and tested the whole week or the whole year, week by week. As well as that, I find that if I'm testing regularly, the athletes become more accustomed to it and they don't have the same level of psychological stress, and they're not as stressed about testing day. As we know from people that have played sport and coached it, testing day is just feared unanimously by everybody. Some people relish it, I suppose, but it's not viewed as a positive thing. It's usually like, oh Jesus, we're testing tonight. A couple of lads will cry off because they know they haven't been doing the work and they're not going to do well. And other people might just get too stressed and might overshoot what they think they're capable of, or they might not be very effective in how they execute on the day, and then obviously that's going to affect the results of the test. So I generally prefer to monitor and test throughout the year. So I'll test all those jumps regularly. As well as that, this is all using output software and output device, which comes highly recommended. Sponsored a podcast last year. And I will also test barbell velocity, and I'm moving towards doing a little bit more of that this year. It's hard when you only have one unit to do all of the jumps and barbell velocity, because obviously it's harder to get through all 25, 30 guys or girls in a session for the jumps, as well as measuring barbell velocity. But we're going to try an alternate days this year, hopefully, and we will only be using it with the senior football team as well. So with the barbell velocity, I'm still kind of figuring it out, but we're probably going to assess a bench press, which isn't very specific, but there's absolutely no issues getting somebody to do a bench press. We'll probably test it at a specific weight, and we're going to assess max and mean power. It won't be the same weight for everybody. It will be based on their projected percentage of their 1RM, or for the athletes that we know what their 1RM is or 3RM is, it will be very specific. As well as that, we're probably going to assess barbell velocity on a trap bar deadlift as well, and that'll be at a specific percentage of either their 1RM or their body weight. I'm trying to figure it out at the moment, what will be most positive in terms of creating a healthily competitive environment within the group, so that they're challenging each other, and so that the guys that are heavy but really strong are still competing with the guys that are light but have good relative strength. So for that reason, it might not matter whether we go body weight or we go, so it would be a percentage of body weight, not their specific body weight, or a percentage of their 1RM, 3RM. But we're figuring that out as we go, and we're probably going to be testing that this week and next week. And it's easily replicable throughout the season when we know that those lifts are going to be in the program. So that is what I'm going to do in terms of testing there, and that's how I'm going to integrate that in. We're also potentially going to get the use of force plates to measure an isometric mid-thigh pull for a strength assessment too. That will be great if we can do that, and we can do that semi-regularly, probably once every 4, 5, 6 weeks. Probably more frequently is better, because obviously you'll get a better average across the year that way, rather than if you do it once every 6 weeks, then it might not be enough, and there may be more factors playing into why somebody does poorly than there is if you did it more frequently, which I definitely saw from doing the jumps. We could infer when somebody was fatigued a little bit better, because we would see if the trend was going down rather than just one specific day when it went down, if that makes sense. And then we're probably going to test using, I've just got Brower speed gates, a timing system, and we're probably going to test a 10 and a 20 meter. That's what's been done in the research a lot. And the sprints in Gaelic football will generally not be over 15 meters, 10, 15 meters anyway. So that's probably most effective. But I'm probably going to throw in a flying 10 as well, because as you guys know, I like to stress my athletes in terms of their sprint volume. I'm thinking whether I'm going to do a 30 meter build on that into a 10 meter fly. I think that's possibly what I'm going to do, because I find that that's probably more applicable across the season based upon how my athletes respond to increasing the distance of the sprints and increasing the distance over which they're sprinting throughout the year and their total sprint volume per session. We generally are able to go up to 40. They're able to tolerate that. Sometimes one of them or two of them might be carrying a niggle, and they'll feel a little bit apprehensive of going over 50, 60 meter sprints. That doesn't mean they won't do it. It just means that it would be maybe a little bit naive of me to test a 50, 60 meter fly or a 10 meter fly with a 50 meter build or a 10 meter fly with a 40 meter build when I can't replicate that in training throughout the season, because it's easy to test if your testing is your training. And I'm really excited about getting the speed gates out with the guys. We have used My Sprint previously, and we did use My Jump, which are both apps that I would recommend if you don't have the same resources that we have, to assess sprint speed and assess their jump height. and they're pretty cheap. I think they're like a tenner each on the App Store. A little bit more time consuming than what we're going to do, and you won't be able to test as frequently as we do, but better than nothing, I suppose, if you are looking at doing a little bit of testing. But as you know, from my perspective, I try to steer clear of having those high stress testing days. I don't think it's that replicable, and I've gone through why I believe so. In terms of aerobic endurance, I know a lot of people go with a Bronco. A lot of people go with their 1K test where they're doing 100 meters and turning each time. I think it's an absolute waste of time, to be honest. I don't think it replicates the game demands, and I don't think it's an effective aerobic or anaerobic test either. Too many turns to be specifically focused on assessing their aerobic and anaerobic fitness. As well as that, you'll get better by just doing the test more because you haven't been exposed to it. You can cheat the test easily with that amount of turns as well, and you're stressing your athletes to maximal fatigue semi-regularly, which isn't going to be the best thing for training. It takes up a chunk of training time, and I just don't like them really, because it's not specific to Gaelic football, and it's not general either, because you're trying to test two things at once. So what would I do? And I'm going to get some hate for that, I'm sure. If you want to test the athlete's ability to, like, aerobic ability, obviously indirect calorimetry with a mouth device is the gold standard best thing, but you're not going to be able to do that with everyone. I try to steer clear of the yo-yo tests, the beep test, etc., because I don't think they're as replicable. If you're trying to assess their ability to run a steady state, I would just do a 1 kilometer test around a track or mark it out around a field and do that with no turns in it. I believe that it's probably more replicable than the others. You're probably more directly assessing their ability to run and how aerobically fit they are than the others. And I think you would be able to do it as somewhat of a warm-up, but I still wouldn't necessarily do it. Because I believe that most of my athletes that I work with are aerobically fit anyway. And I believe that we can assess their aerobic fitness through the use of tempo or mass running anyway, by assessing the quality and by keen observation of how effectively they cover the ground and what group of athletes I have them in terms of their total running volume and high speed running covered in that session. So I don't think it's necessary, but if you want to do it and it works in your environment, then by all means go and do it. I'm just giving my perspective and why I do it that way. And if you don't agree with me, then that's fine. And if I don't agree with you, then that's fine as well. It's different strokes for different folks, as they say. And certain things will work in one environment that won't work in another. But that's just how I believe is the best way to do so in my environment, I suppose. In terms of plyos, acceleration, change of direction work, you all know I'll split my days up into one linear focus day, one change of direction focus day, and then one day where we can work on whatever we want to work on that day. We'll use a short to long approach in terms of the acceleration and sprint distance. So it's easy to do inside, actually. A lot of teams want to train inside for January going into February just because of the weather. And if you're only sprinting over 30, 40 meters, then you're probably able to do that within a hall environment. As well as that, you can do the plyos there too. And there is a positive aspect to that you will become more reactive in doing it in the hall, because the hall ground is harder and the gym ground is harder than obviously a soft pitch in January, February. It is interesting though that when you go back to pitch, you can sometimes see some people presenting with more chronic issues around the Achilles calf. Not if you manage it fantastically well and you steadily progress frequency. So that's why I'd recommend, even if you're in a hall, to get out onto the pitch at least once per week to do potentially just your conditioning work, or you might do some sprint, change of direction work and some skill work out there as well. Skill work is obviously extremely important in a preseason, and I don't know why people neglect it. I believe that we should enjoy what we're doing and enjoy the sport. So it should be a privilege to get out with a bag of balls with your mates have a few shots, work on your kick pass and work on whatever you need to work on. And you will get a lot from directly working on that, because a lot of people don't do that. They just get the opportunities in training. And I don't believe the opportunities provided by a team training session are necessarily always enough to develop specific qualities. That's why if you need to do additional and extra sessions, you should be doing additional and extra sessions. Change of direction wise, we'll start with more of a concentric and movement focused approach before building from general to more specific, from a closed to a more open environment, and working on specific aspects of change of direction in relation to Gaelic football. A lot of games, a lot of mechanics focused stuff, and stressing athletes and putting them in positions that they haven't been in. A lot of a learning focus in terms of projection, in terms of position, in terms of how to get there, in terms of disassociation between the upper body and the lower body, and steadily just progressing it as we go. Having some sort of a system as to why you're doing it, not just random shit being thrown at the wall and hoping some of it sticks. And then just, you will get a little bit from just playing games. The game can be specific to Gaelic football, or it doesn't have to be as well if you're trying to facilitate a little bit of fun. For example, if you're indoors, a little bit of Olympic handball, a little bit of five-a-side, a little bit of ultimate frisbee, a little bit of any number of games you could play. End zone ball, anything. And you will get some elements of, obviously, change of direction and agility in there. You will be working on communication as a team. You will be working on some elements of aerobic and anaerobic fitness, and they won't even notice they're doing it as well. It's definitely probably, you're not going to get enough to really improve your aerobic and anaerobic system if you're already fit, but if you're not fit, you will get a lot from it. And there's definitely room for a little bit of fun and a little bit of enjoyment in any environment as well. So I definitely would suggest having a bit of a laugh at times. I love bringing a professional approach, and I'm probably guilty at times of bringing too much professionalism, too much elite focus, and it probably leads to athletes sometimes feeling like, oh, can we just have a bit of crack? So if on one day you want to facilitate a bit of crack, and for your warm-up play a bit of five-a-side, play a bit of soccer, play a different sport. I know we got the rugby ball out a little bit last year, it was a bit of crack. Then do so. Yeah, like that's why you're there. You want to have fun. Refreshing to change it up for sure. And sure, it's not really specific, but you can get the specific work done elsewhere. You can fit in 10 minutes of having a bit of fun with your team, for sure. Then in terms of conditioning, I've gone through, I would usually go with tempo, progressing the running volume and the length of each tempo run steadily, going from extensive initially, where we might go with a 60 to 75 second rolling clock, progressing to a 30-second rolling clock in a more intensive tempo down the line. A rolling clock simply means you're running a certain distance, and after you reach the 60 seconds, you're running that distance back, if that makes sense. So say you're running 100 or 120 meters in 60 seconds, you'll run it at 70% of your max velocity, or around 6-7 out of 10 in terms of effort, your maximum velocity being your max speed. You'll run that with good technique. You'll run it as best as you can, focused on improving your ability to tolerate high speed running, we call it, and improving your execution of that type of running. And you might reach the 100 meters in 25 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever. You'll rest the remaining time, which would be 35, 40 seconds, and then you'll run back. And you'll do a number of those efforts, and then you'll take a break, and then you'll do another number of those efforts. Usually I'll start with a total running volume for high speed running of about 1 kilometer, or slightly under maybe, or slightly above, depending on the group. I'll have a number of different groups that the athletes will fall into. So I might have 2 to 3 different groups based on their ability to tolerate good running mechanics for that distance. I might drop people down and up groups as we go through the weeks and through the sessions, depending on how they're responding and how their execution is. And Then, obviously, with the intensive tempo, we'll go 30-second rolling clock. We'll go maybe 60, 70, 80 meters. We might add in some change of direction movements. We might add in some skill work. We might add in some contact conditioning stuff for 5 seconds as we intensify down the line. Same thing, they'll run the distance in 14, 15 seconds, they'll rest the remainder and run back. And we'll do that throughout the year, and I'll bleed that in throughout the year as well, especially on our green or our lower days, based on the Charlie Francis model and the model for structuring sessions that I've gone through previously. We'll get some conditioning through games, as I've said as well. We probably won't throw them into small-sided games straight away, but if you're doing a small duration of it and you've built a little bit of tolerance for training already over 2 to 3 weeks, then yeah, throw them in. Just make sure it's not too intense and you're providing good rest time so that they are able to execute well. And then we'll get some conditioning from our running mechanics drills as well. So that is conditioning, because we're conditioning the limbs to be able to tolerate specific positions and get to specific positions time and time again and tolerate a longer distance of that position. It's the same principle as tolerating a longer sprint distance, which is essentially conditioning the body to tolerate that sprint distance. So that can still be termed as conditioning. Then in terms of if they need more conditioning and they feel they need more conditioning for their aerobic or anaerobic system, we can prescribe off-feet conditioning, because if they're on feet 2 to 3 times a week, I don't believe Gaelic footballers need necessarily, or hurlers, another day or another 2 days of low intensity steady state running where they're plodding along and getting loads more contacts, which might drive up their injury risk if we are doing the right amount within the other 3 sessions. So that's why I go with more off-feet conditioning sessions away from the pitch, which can be bike, which can be rower, which can be ski erg, which can be assault bike, etc. If we're going aerobically, I might give them long duration steady state stuff. I might give them 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, getting to maybe a zone 2, no more than a zone 3 on those 30 seconds on efforts. And then if they're going more anaerobically down the line, I might go efforts of 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off for multiple efforts. And I would do so getting to maybe zone 3, zone 4 on that 20 seconds. And then as I progress to 15, 10 seconds, they can go really, really hard all out for that 10, 15 seconds. And that's really anaerobically focused, that work. And it's quite taxing as well. So there'll only be room to do that once a week, I would say. And then they should base the amount of efforts that they do based on the amount of training that you're done. So a useful way at the end of sessions, if you feel like you need more conditioning, which I've stolen from PJF Performance, I think, over in the States, he's working in basketball as well. He has used it with athletes over there in terms of mass running. I think it's just as useful in terms of tempo, or if you're using mass running, it's really effective as well. If you want to do extras at the end of the training session, that's fine. But to know how much extras you have a capacity to do, it's useful to assess RPE. So rating of perceived exertion, so how hard the session was. And we ask all of our athletes for RPE after every session. So if the session was a 6 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10, let's say, just for argument's sake, 7 out of 10, that means you have 3 left over. Okay, so 3, you multiply 3 by 2 and you get 6. So that means you have room to do 6 tempo runs additionally at the end of the session. Or what he did was he said you have room to do 6 minutes of mass running total at the end of the session. So if you had an RPE 4 session, you would have the capacity to do 12 extra runs, if that makes sense. 12 extra tempo runs, and that might be intensive, it might be extensive. I'd probably go more intensive on 30-second rolling clock, and you go 60, 70 meters, do that 6 times. That will take you 3 minutes. You're out the gap, you're done. And then in terms of if it's dark, if it's wet, and you don't want to do the additional work immediately post session, which is undoubtedly probably the best place to do it and the best time to do it, I have said that if you want to do efforts aerobically, then rather than multiplying it by 2, maybe you multiply it by 4, and then you get, for a 7 out of 10 session, you can do 12 minutes of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off on the bike additionally. And then obviously if the RPE of the session is lower, you have more scope. So if you were an RPE 4 out of 10, then you'd have 6 by 4, you get 24 efforts of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. And I probably wouldn't go more than about 25 efforts of that. But you can keep it low intensity, as I've said. You can go zone 2, zone 3 on those 30-second on efforts and 30 seconds off efforts. Then try and get your heart rate down back to zone 1, but it probably won't come back down. You'll probably be within zone 2 for the whole thing. But that's fine if you're in zone 2 for the whole thing. That's fantastic. Because 25-30 minutes of zone 2 cardio is great additional extras if you need extra conditioning. And that's probably given as much of a covering of how I'd approach preseason S&C that I can do at the moment without any more specific questions. So if you have any specific questions, as I've said, just get in touch. I won't bite your head off. I'm happy to answer, happy to connect with coaches, athletes, etc. I do have some spaces available in my premium level online coaching group. They're getting snapped up fast though. And if you are interested, I would recommend you get in touch with me at least by the end of next week. That will probably be my cutoff date for taking on any new clients. I estimate that'll probably be full by then. So don't hesitate. Message me pre-season if you want to get into that group and receive the value of having me deliver all of this to you guys, because I'm sure it sounds like it's a lot, but that's my job. I deliver this to the individual to the right degree that they need. But if you're not in a position to get into that premium level online coaching group, I do have a product/service coming out very soon that will be of benefit for you, especially when you're in a GPP phase. I am partnering with Kate McDade, as you may know, NutriKate. Kate is a fantastic nutritionist, and we are going to be delivering a online coaching platform/group for the preseason that will cater for both the S&C perspective and cater for your nutritional perspective. It's probably going to be bi-weekly calls and Q&As. It's limited as well. We're going to limit it to 20 male athletes and 20 female athletes. GAA players, so Gaelic footballers or hurlers. It will be a program provided by me with regular Q&As with both me and Kate. So at least once a month we'll be checking in. We'll give you a short webinar presentation on a different topic as requested by you or as seen fit by us every month. One from me, one from Kate, just so it's not a little bit too much, and we'll try and keep those to 30 minutes and then a 30-minute Q&A for the whole group. It's going to be delivered by 2 fantastic practitioners. I wouldn't miss out on it. So if you're, and it's a little bit of a lower price point than obviously the individualized coaching group that I just spoke about, because we're able to deliver it to more people because of the platform and because you're not getting the specific individualized approach that I would bring on that premium group. But just because it's not the best thing doesn't mean there's no value in it. There's going to be high value in it, and we're going to deliver the best possible product and service that we possibly can. It's really exciting. It's great to be starting to build a community and working with a fantastic practitioner in Kate. So if you're interested in that, message me, Performance, as soon as you can, and we will be taking the first cohort in the next 2 weeks as well. And I believe after that cohort is in, we're not going to be taking another cohort for probably another month or 2. So really, I entrust and suggest that you get in touch as soon as you possibly can if you're interested in that, because it is limited as well. If you have questions about it, we're happy to answer them. But other than that, great to be back in the podcast. Great to be delivering more value for you guys. If you have any specific questions, you know where I am. If you enjoyed this, and I hope you did enjoy it, please remember to like it, share it, and send it.